Yes, I figured you would.
Yeah.
This was a cool one. This was for the very first all-woman comic book ever, and I did all these characters that somebody else owned, and being a hippie, it never even occurred to me to ask for permission.
What was your idea for this? Like, what was your...
Well, you know, the underground comic scene was totally male-dominated, and it wasn't just male-dominated, but it was very misogynistic. So I knew that women had to get represented. I was living here at this point in San Francisco, and I had to have somewhere to be published. And I found It Ain't Me, Babe, which was the very first feminist newspaper in America. I had thought it was the first in the West Coast, but it was actually the first in America. Yeah, isn't that cool? And so I started drawing for them, and because I had their moral support, I could go further. And I said, well, why shouldn't we do a comic? Oh wait, there's a photo of the whole group of us here in the back. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of us. It all started with my mother teaching me to read at the age of 4. She was a school teacher, and no greater gift has ever been given to me. You know, it opened up a world for me. Along with everything else, I read comics. And my parents, in those days, a lot of parents used to worry that comics were not good for you. You know, that they turned kids into little juvenile delinquents. But they were not worried about me because I read everything, you know, comics and books. And of course, I also always drew. I mean, I drew from the moment that I could hold a crayon. So, and my mother being a teacher, she would bring home reams of 8.5 by 11 paper. I'd fold the books in half, the pages, and I'd get 4 pages, and I would just start at the beginning and end up at the end and draw a comic. So I was always into comics. I would basically go to the candy store. That's where, in those days, you got books at your corner candy store, comics, and some people at the corner drugstore. And I would buy whatever comic starred a girl, you know? Yeah. As long as it had a girl on the cover and the girl was the star of the comic, I would buy it. I was bored silly with any comics that were just men.
Yeah.
He was calling about the costume. So I just sketched it out while he was talking to Frank Frazetta. I sketched it out on a piece of scrap paper, and I passed it over to him, and he said, oh, just a minute, there's a young lady here who knows exactly what I had in mind. And he put me on the phone, and I described it to Frank Frazetta. I never wrote her, I did not create her, and I'm really tired of people carrying on about Vampirella, because that's the most minor thing. Of all the things I have done, that is the most minor. So, forget about Vampirella.
Okay, yes I will. Yes I will.
Anything else to do? Oh, Charlie.
T for trouble.
Trouble is his middle name. When underground comics started in the 60s, mainstream comics were hampered by the Comics Code. You know, nobody would carry them if they didn't have that little seal on the cover that said Comics Code Seal of Approval or whatever it said. And that Comic Code was a strict bunch of rules for what you could and couldn't show in comics, which made a lot of the comics really kind of lame and boring, and, you know, whereas underground comics started as a reaction to the Comics Code. Underground comics talked about us hippies, and our alternative lifestyles, you know, and the stories we told were based on our alternative lifestyles, even though, like I wrote a lot of science fiction stories, but they were still based on, you know, they came from my alternative lifestyle. the very first story ever done about an out lesbian. Really amazing. I mean, it hadn't even occurred to me that I was doing a first. Sandy was my roommate, and I wanted to tell her story because it was a cool story. So off and on, I have done Wonder Woman. This is the one that I did. My Wonder Woman has always been the traditional Wonder Woman. You know, the one over there in that art. One of her outstanding features is compassion. Yeah. You know, in the 40s, when Marston, who was the writer, William Moulton Marston, wrote about her, he would stress love, that she depends on the power of love. They gave it to me to do like 4 issues. Why don't we give it to Trina? She likes Wonder Woman, and even if she fucks it up, it's only 4 issues, you know? You know, by the 80s and the 90s, the only places to distribute our comics were comic book stores, which is where you get comics. But it didn't used to be like that. We used to have other distribution. And the comic book stores were just a bunch of guys who wanted to carry superhero comics and read superhero comics. And, you know, they didn't even want to carry Underground, and God forbid, Underground's by women. I mean, you know. Let me read you, this is a wonderful, this is from the last issue, if I can find it. It's the editorial by Karen Leshin, who basically says it all, and she did the cover too. Look at that cover.
Yeah.
This comic has been printed on cheap paper, which will turn yellow in a few years. The print room was too small, and all the stores, as usual, will sell out, but they won't reorder because, quote, women don't buy comics, unquote. Bullshit! How did they sell out in the first place? It's always like that. What a waste of time and energy. Forget it. You know, it took mainstream comics, it took them a long time to get it, you know? But suddenly they're going, duh! All those comics are selling, and if we did comics like that, gosh, girls would buy them. You know, it took them that long to figure it out, you know, but they're doing it now. In almost 2016, certainly don't believe anyone who says girls don't read comics or girls don't draw comics, because at this point it's ridiculous, you know, so just do it.
Sorry, I stumbled.
I think that I want them to remember that I brought back to the public memory a lot of women cartoonists, early 20th century women cartoonists who were forgotten because nobody wrote about them. Because when guys wrote histories of comics, they were interested in Jack Kirby and the Hulk, you know what I mean? And the big discovery, really my major discovery, when researching and writing all these books I've written on women cartoonists, is that if you're not written about, you're forgotten. So these women were forgotten, but I've written about them and they're not forgotten anymore. People know who Tarpley Mills is now. People know who Nell Brinkley was. People know who Lily Renee is. They know about these women because I've written about them.